In this lecture, I'd like to deal with the issue of how to report on police agencies in the court system, including the juvenile justice system, and also how to report on victims. How is it that you need to approach a victim? How can you get an interview with a victim? What do you say to a victim when you're doing the interview? This is a critically important part of journalism because so many times, the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. The idea that if there is a crime of violence that involves people in your community, the reporter's going to sometimes be one of the first people to arrive at that scene and try to get information about what has happened to the victims. So I'd like to start first by telling you a little bit about my background. I spent a little bit more than 9 years training police in the United States and writing about police. I was part of the community policing movement with the late Dr. Robert Trajanowiz, who was the director of the School of Criminal Justice here at Michigan State University for many years. He and I co-wrote 2 books on community policing, so I spent quite a bit of time seeing all the different police agencies across the United States. And I think the first thing that you need to know when you're looking at your beat area and you're thinking about the police agency you're going to have to cover is that each agency is truly unique. There are 17,000 police agencies in the United States, and frankly, no 2 of them are alike. You can have a wonderful police agency almost across the road from a police agency down the street that's struggling, that maybe is having difficulty in dealing with a diverse community. So the challenge for many outsiders is that police agencies look all alike to us from the outside, but from the inside they can look very different. Another challenge for reporters is that police are not often quick to share information. Sometimes it's because it's a crime that's under investigation and they don't want to compromise the information that goes to the prosecutor and run the risk that some slip from the department costs them a conviction of somebody who's a danger to the community and they want to get them off the streets. Sometimes it's because they want to avoid embarrassing mistakes that they have made, or how it is that they've been dealing with problem officers, or have they been dealing with problem officers. I talked with the police chief many years ago when I was at the FBI Academy doing some training, and he took me aside and he said, I had a police officer in my department that I knew was having trouble. I'd heard rumors from the community that he was roughing up people. I was concerned about what he was doing, but I thought, well, I'll wait till it reaches a greater level of crisis before I deal with it. And what happened in the interim was that the man tried to murder his estranged wife, set fire to the house, went on a rampage himself, and the police chief said to me, I really wish I had dealt with that problem earlier. It's a human business. People have to make a lot of split-second decisions. One of the challenges in understanding police work is that a lot of the attention of the press focuses on the time when the 911 call comes in and a hostage is somewhere barricaded in a home. The police streak to the address and they have to make split-second decisions about how to try to save the people inside. The reality is that fewer than 5% of the calls for service that any police agency receives in any given year involve a crime in progress, where how quickly they get there will make a difference in the outcome. Most of the crime in a community is discovered later, after the fact. It's where you go to the store and you look in the till and the money's gone. Or you return home after vacation, open up the garage door and your lawnmower is missing. That's where the bulk of the crime is, but we do have a police department that, as you might imagine, has to be organized around that relatively rare incident where streaking to the door in time can mean the difference between life and death for the people in the community. But it's a challenge for police agencies. If you look at your municipal budget, and I suggest that's a good place to start to try to understand your police department, most police agencies are the largest part of the municipal budget. They come in somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the money that the local municipality spends on public safety, so they're a significant part of the budget. In most communities, in most situations, a municipal police agency, the police chief typically serves at the discretion of the city manager or of the mayor. It's a political appointment in that sense. If they run into a politically sensitive situation where the mayor thinks that he either is getting too big for his britches, he or she, the police chief, they may get rid of them. There are some famous cases of big city mayors being nervous that the police chief was going to run against them. Or if there's an embarrassing incident and somebody has to take the fall, the police chief is going to be the person that's asked to fall on his sword and leave. So it's a very difficult job, hard to run an agency. There's a big difference, too. I mean, look at the size of different police agencies. There are 760,000 sworn police officers in the United States. Sworn means that they are the people in uniform or a detective who has been sworn to uphold the public safety and serve the community. If we think about it, though, there are some small municipalities, townships that may have an officer or two who sort of patrol the downtown business district, and that's the extent of the policing that they have. And yet you have a city like New York City that currently has 34,000 officers. I remember, I think it was once up to a high of 42,000. I have lived in communities smaller than the size of the New York City Police Department. It is a huge operation with people at many layers, and ultimately trying to get a handle on the whole department would be almost impossible. It's a very difficult challenge. So your challenge is figuring out the size of the officer. You want to know how many sworn, how many civilians they have in the department. More and more we've seen a trend in policing where they've civilianized certain jobs rather than send somebody through the expensive police academy and pay them at those police wages. They pay them to do specialty jobs within the department, but they don't have to be a sworn police officer to do so. A lot of communities are also relying on a lot of volunteers. Part of the community policing movement was engaging more people in the community to come in and work as volunteers, whether it's for records management, it may be for a particular kind of expertise. I know the Alexandria Police Department outside of Washington, D.C. benefited from the fact they had a lot of retired CIA people who would come in and do data analysis for them and show them how to manipulate the information they were getting from their 911 calls to see crime trends. Which brings up another big change in policing. Police agencies differ in how they use computers. Some agencies in Michigan, for example, were very slow to even put a computer into the police department. Long after other offices around the city had changed, they were holdouts. Now we see departments like New York City was really at the forefront of this with what is called CompStat, C-O-M-S-T-A-T, which is using data analysis to identify crime trends in specific areas, and then putting a team of police officers in charge of finding out what's going on in that area, why are burglaries going up, how can you solve the problem. It's called problem-solving policing, community policing added to that by stationing and decentralizing police officers so that they had time to spend in communities to understand what the community priorities were, not just the priorities of the police agency, but what did people in neighborhoods care about. Policing in the United States is very complex. If you're living in a city and you're covering a beat within that city, you need to look at the municipal police department. But you also need to know, do they have a sort of task force arrangement with other police agencies at different levels? How do they interrelate with the county sheriff's department? Remember, the county sheriff is elected by the people. That's different than the police chief who is nominated and approved by the city management. The voters directly approve the county sheriff, so that's a different kind of job. How do they relate? Do they share information? I was talking with an attorney in town years ago who had been part of a case involving a local serial killer, and he was in the prosecutor's department at the time. And he said that literally the failure of various police agencies, the state police that sit on the top basically of the whole state, the county officials, and the municipal officials in that case did not share information. Everybody wanted to solve the case on their own, so they didn't share as much information as they should. And he argued that 2 women died unnecessarily because they would have known who the killer was if all those pieces of information had come together in one place. So look at the issue of cooperation. Part of your challenge in getting to work and report on a police agency for your beat is getting them to talk to you. That can be complicated. Even reporters who have had a long-standing relationship with a local police department can run into trouble because all of a sudden they write something that maybe the police department doesn't like, and the basket that used to contain those daily summaries for them that they'd pick up in the morning isn't there anymore, so they're going to have to dig out the information. The good news is that in the United States, policing is a much more open business than it is in other countries. We had a visiting Fulbright fellow here from Japan, and she said that the only people who could be briefed by the police were people who were licensed by the government as reporters, who had their press passes. We need press passes to get in many cases, but the police here are pretty loose on that. And she said they would come out and they would announce the news to you in the morning, and then you might have to spend the rest of the day scrambling to verify it. She said she spent a lot of time at 1 o'clock in the morning knocking on police officials' homes in order to try to get them to talk to her after hours to give her the real scoop on what was happening. But I don't think for most students you're going to have the opportunity to develop long-standing relationships. Most of the cops and courts reporters that really dig out the unknown stories have long-standing relationships with the people in the department. It can take months, if not years, to develop those kinds of relationships. Part of the challenge then is you may find yourself having to file a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, to get information from police departments. So it can be difficult. There's other kinds of analytical stories you can do, however. You can take a look at data in the aggregate, see what kinds of crimes are on the increase, see what kinds of crimes are decreasing. Use that budget as your guide as well. One of the biggest changes in policing has been the idea that now we need to have Homeland Security. Homeland Security is putting money into a lot of police agencies nationwide to deal with terrorism. Is terrorism a real threat in your community? Should federal dollars be spent on changing the priorities of the local police department? We have sort of two visions of police in this society. We have the RoboCop, from the movie that showed the RoboCop in Detroit, who's sort of the, kind of looks like the Homeland Security version of policing nowadays. Or should it be that Norman Rockwell, officer friendly, handling the lost kid, the ice cream cone, and befriending him? Can police agencies do both? Dealing with the courts is also dealing with a complex system that is unlike any other. We know that in the United States, there are so many different police agencies because our founding fathers were very concerned about the idea of a national police force. They didn't want that much power concentrated in one place. So they set up all of these local agencies and let them be independent fiefdoms because we wanted as much local control as possible. The challenge with the court system, I think, over time, is that there is indeed, in many cases, a municipal court system, a county court system, the state appellate courts, the state Supreme Court. Then there's the whole federal courts on top. It can be a very complex system for a beginner to get a handle on all the different agencies that might be involved. If you're doing a fairly simple crime case, it might be a case where there has been a shooting but nobody's been injured, and somebody has been arrested, and then there's going to be the investigation, and they're going to be arraigned, and then they're going to go to trial maybe a year later, and then they're going to be convicted, and then there might be an appeal. That's a fairly straightforward process. But that's only a fraction of the overall court system in any community, so you need to know a bit about the larger picture as well. There's an entirely separate juvenile justice system in which the police, of course, are the funnel that bring both adults and juveniles into the system, but then juveniles are immediately sort of segregated off into their own separate system. The idea behind that was that over the years we felt that juveniles really deserved a second chance, that the things and the dumb mistakes you made as a young person shouldn't be held against you for the rest of your life. In some ways, that attitude has been changing, and we're becoming harder on juveniles. We're saying that if the crime is heinous enough, we want you tried as an adult. We want you put into the adult system in some cases and tried on that basis and put into prison sometimes for the rest of your life. This is a change in attitude, as we've seen changes occur throughout history in how the police are treated and how the courts are meant to handle the problems that we're dealing with in society. We incarcerate a larger percentage of our people than any other nation on the face of the earth by far. We streaked past South Africa and China years ago. We now have at least 2.2, coming up on 2.3 million people in some kind of supervisory custody. And so the challenge for you is that it's a very expensive system, and we need to look at how that money is being spent. Is it being spent wisely? Should we take a youngster who has maybe was the person driving the car for a crime, and because of our laws put them away for life when they commit that crime at 14 or 15 or 16 years old? Or should we rethink those things? So those are big issues. So you need to remember the juvenile justice system, because quite often I think that whole system is obscured from view and we don't see it as often. There was and has been a movement in that group known as restorative justice, which tries to come up with creative dispute resolution opportunities to deal with problems outside of the formal system. You'll see school districts, for example, that handle problems internally that might previously have gone into the juvenile justice system. Those might be some good stories for you. There's also probate court and family court that deal with various issues related to family disputes, and there are opportunities there for good stories on in this recession. Are parents getting the child support to the same degree that they were before? Are we seeing seeing those rates decline. It's an incredibly complex system, very expensive part of our overall tax structure, and that's another area that you're going to want to have to look at. I also would like to talk to you about how I think reporters end up covering crime cases in particular in one of three ways. We call it Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 stories in the Victims in the Media program. The Act 1 story is the typical case where maybe there's an armed robbery at a gas station. Somebody comes in with their, they've got a blue watch cap on and they're wearing a green jacket, and they put a gun in the face of the person behind the counter and say, "Give me all the money on the register." And then they grab the money and they leave. And you're the reporter who's sent out there on that breaking news story. Your job is not to try to capture all sorts of local color. It's to find out what the heck happened. One of the challenges for you is that you may have to interview that clerk who has just had a life-altering experience. And if you get there fast enough, you may find that that person is still shaking. A lot of the crime calls, that you hear about where the reporters get there, it's because they've been listening to the police radio. You can do that online now and find out what's going on in the community, and they can get there just about as fast as the patrol car does sometimes, depending on how close they are. Now, when you're talking to somebody in that situation, you have to realize that, yes, they have not been shot, they have not been physically assaulted, but it is a traumatic experience. A friend of mine said that, there's nothing that concentrates the mind like looking down the barrel of a gun. So the reality is that that person may well be in shock, and your challenge is to figure out how to get that person to talk to you, how to get them to give you the information that you need for your story. Your first thing to do is, if they've got goosebumps and the hair is standing up on the back of their arms and they start to faint, you're going to need to sit them down and put their head between their knees and cover them up with a blanket and get a little water into them and get the medics over there to take care of them. But if the person is just rattled, your job is still to try to get information from them if the police will let you get to them. And the reality is that the challenge is, if you just go up and say, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you about what just happened," chances are you made it very easy for that person to just say no. They're going to want to get home, and they're going to want to tell their loved ones that they're okay. They have plenty of other things that they're going to want to be doing rather than talking to you. So you have to give them a good reason to talk to you. You have to figure out, why would that person take the time now when they're so deeply rattled to talk to me? So one of the things that we suggest is, first of all, you want to show your compassion, your empathy, by expressing the fact that you recognize the person is in trauma. There are two phrases that we teach everybody, which is, "I am sorry for what happened to you," or if the person has lost someone, "I'm sorry for your loss." The New York City Police Department trains all of its 34,000 police officers to use those phrases because they know that victims want to hear that level of compassion from anybody who's going to be asking them questions. So start with that, but then try to give that person a reason to talk to you. In this case, you could say, "I'm hoping you could spare a couple minutes of your time because I'm from the local newspaper, and I'd really like to be able to tell our readers about what happened to you. And maybe if you could give me a description, we can get this guy off the street before he really does shoot somebody." Now that gives that person a really good reason to want to talk to you, and you're not being overly manipulative, because guess what? It's the truth. We have this vision, that all the crimes are solved by women in tight blouses with those crime scene kits coming in and dusting for fingerprints and all of that. But I'll tell you this much, unless the person who did that stick-up kissed the plexiglass screen and left some DNA in there in the data bank, that isn't how most crimes get solved. Most crimes get solved because of little bits of information that come into the police department from citizens who realize that they need to share what they know in the hope of getting this person off the street. In this case, for example, we can see that if I'm living 2 blocks away and I see somebody in the blue watch cap and a green jacket run by me fast, I think, I wonder what that's all about. I'm not going to pick up 911 and call the police necessarily and say, "Hey, I saw this guy running down the street. He looked suspicious." In most communities, that's not enough to really trigger a very quick 911 response. But if I read in the newspaper the next day that at the same time, or shortly before that, there had been an armed robbery at the gas station 2 blocks away, I might call the police agency and say, "Let me talk to one of those detectives. I think I might be able to help you. I saw that guy come down the street and, he's friends with those folks that live at this address." Or, "I saw him jump into a blue Chevy and, gee, Maybe my neighbor, the neighborhood watch captain, might have part of that license plate for you if you follow up with them. That's the real way that most crimes in the community are solved, and the news organizations in those communities play such a critical role with their breaking news coverage and making sure that the community gets the information that they need. And I'll also tell you that what happens, of course, the next day is that people look at the address for the gas station and say, guess I won't go there for a week or two, but you know, it's probably the safest gas station for at least the next few days because everybody's watching it. But those are the breaking news stories where your job is to get the facts as quickly as possible, often from people who are in trauma, people who may not be all that thrilled about talking to you, and you have to figure out a way to help them understand that they play a critical role in your coverage and that you're not just there as a media vulture, there to rip off and sensationalize what happened to them, but you really do need their assistance in dealing with this issue. Now, the second kind of story that we talk about is what we call the Act 2 story. And those differ typically in time because they're the follow-up stories. It could be that the case goes to trial 6 months or a year later, or it is a case where we do an anniversary story. You know that every year around September 11th, you're going to be hearing or reading stories about people in your community that had some tie to the terrorist attack in New York City. Those are the kinds of things that warrant anniversary coverage. Or there can be the continuing mystery story. So-and-so is still missing. We still talk about the old case from the 1930s of Judge Crater, who disappeared many years ago, and they never did find out what happened to Judge Crater. But there are continuing mystery stories. So many news organizations consider those sort of the traditional stories that they will do for an Act 2 story. Part of your challenge, especially with a case going to trial, is that very often it can be hard to get information out of people, specifically in the case of the defense attorneys who are not going to want you to talk to their client. The prosecutors may well tell the victims that they don't want them to talk to the media. Why? Because if they say, well, the person had blue eyes, and it turns out the person actually has green eyes, and that's in your news account, it can be used to impeach their testimony and raise questions about whether they really saw what they think they saw. So we see both sides often muzzling the people involved, and it can be hard to dig out the information. So those are real challenges. The other thing I would like to forewarn you about is if you are going to do a follow-up story on somebody who has been victimized, place the courtesy phone call to the family, even if you don't need to quote them in the story, just so that they know the story is coming. There's nothing worse than for victim families than to be blindsided by coverage that they hadn't expected. The third kind of story that we talk about is the Act 3 story. And the Act 3 story, I just say, is the story that breaks the mold. It's the one that usually is an enterprise story or a story that looks at a crime in a larger context, that tells us more about what we're doing as a society to deal with these mythic issues, the kinds of things that are the stuff of Shakespeare's plays, jealousy, murder, revenge, and also to look at the broader impact on society. How are we spending our resources? What about victimless crime? Should we be rethinking some of our drug laws? Should we be rethinking our approach to the war on terror? We constantly need to be reevaluating what we're doing in this area in order to make sure that we're not being counterproductive, that we're not wasting money, that we're not being as effective as we could be in creating the kind of society that we want. These enterprise stories are the ones that dig deeper, that are the long-form narratives that give us greater information, greater understanding, the kinds of things that help us understand and feel compassion for the people who find themselves in these circumstances. There's some other stories that can be done that are more issue-oriented. The Long Beach Press-Telegram won the award for a story on young 17-year-old Martine Perry. They promised themselves they would do a story on the next person under 18 who was killed by gunfire. And the reporting team told me that they had actually envisioned, a youngster, maybe a 9-year-old, finding a gun under a bed that would have been tucked away and shooting a 6-year-old pal. So they were surprised when the case came in and it turned out to be young Martine Perry, and his other name was Little Stalker. He was a gang member. And you and I know not many communities have much sympathy necessarily for gang members. They kind of don't want to hear those stories as much as maybe we should be hearing them. But they went out and they covered this case. He had been standing on his front porch with a 40-ounce beer in a brown paper bag, and somebody went by and shots rang out, and he was dead. He died by the time when they had him in surgery at the hospital. And what they also learned by pursuing this, it was only a story and buried in the back, a few inches in the back of the A section the day after it happened, but by digging into the story, they learned a lot more. They learned, for example, that young Martine had been an Eagle Scout a few years earlier. An Eagle Scout? I mean, how can that be? How did he go from being an Eagle Scout to being Little Stalker? Well, what they found out was that his mother had died after a long lingering illness, and Dad, who had had some problems with alcohol, really fell into a depression after the loss of his wife, and the family really fell apart, and they skidded down the socioeconomic ladder. Dad lost his job, they ended up in a low-income neighborhood, and all of a sudden Martine was flailing, looking around for meaning in his life, and he found that in gang life. That added a bit of compassion to an otherwise not necessarily terribly sympathetic story. But at the same time, they also thought, how can we get our audience, who really don't have much connection with those communities, to understand what's happening? And they did a longer form piece, and the subtext of that, the tagline for that story is Path of a Bullet, how one 22-cent bullet cost our community $1 million. Now that'll capture the attention of some people in the community. I mean, they pay taxes. How was $1 million spent on this? Well, of course, the moment that Martine was struck by that bullet, various expensive systems come into play. The police streak there, and they find that they have to do an investigation. That takes a lot of resources. Ultimately, they arrested 3 juveniles. Those juveniles were from the same sort of neighborhood, and they didn't have money for private attorneys, so they were given public defenders, and a very expensive criminal justice system kicks in. They were all tried and convicted and sentenced to prison for 25 years to life, and if you look at the cost of keeping somebody behind bars for a year, it comes in at around $30,000 to $35,000. So you can do the math and find out that that's a substantial portion of that budget. You can also take a look at the fact that Martine, by then, his family had no health insurance. He was taken to the emergency room. Very expensive systems came into play. He was rushed into neurosurgery in an attempt to try to save him. And those bills were ultimately picked up by the taxpayer in one way or another at a municipal hospital. So the package of stories that the Long Beach Press-Telegram did attempted to illuminate all of these different issues. How can we prevent this kind of violence? How can we find alternatives for young people? Why can't we build a better, stronger safety net, either through tax dollars or through volunteerism, to make sure that young men don't fall through the cracks and end up on one side or the other of that terrible divide on any given night in some communities where young people end up dead on the street? Those are the kinds of stories that are really important, and it makes journalism a noble business. It's not just something that you do and it doesn't matter, or it's just a job. It's something that can really change lives. And the important thing is to remember the importance overall of accuracy. These are stories that are critical. You're talking about, in some cases, the last memories of people being included in those stories. So you want to make sure that you get everything right. In reality, what the media does is that they're not just, parasitically living off the misery of others to sell newspapers or to get eyeballs onto the website. They're really trying to help people celebrate the lives of people they've lost, deal with these tragic issues in our community, find better answers, and give a sort of sense of dignity to the entire process and deal with these issues in a way that we can all respect. So I'm hoping that you'll take some of these lessons and apply them when you go out and do your public affairs reporting. Hope some of you will figure that this is your calling in life and that that's what you'll want to do in the future. Thank you for listening.